Watch The Atheist Experience live Sundays at 4:30 p.m. Central. Visit tiny.cc/YTAXP and call into the show at 512-991-9242 or connect to the show online at tiny.cc/callaxp.
It's time to get sexy on Secular Sexuality.
Hello and welcome to Secular Sexuality, the ACA show that I have to tell you is just embarrassingly excited to be talking about monkey dicks tonight. My name is Christy Powell. I am joined again tonight by one of the most overqualified people that I have ever been able to corner and ask questions about monkey dicks to. So I am taking full advantage tonight. Welcome back, Forrest Valkai.
Hey, thank you so much for having me, dude.
Yeah,
I always love getting to do shows with you.
Yeah, I'm super excited to get into it because, we're going to be talking about primate anatomy and trying to understand the form and function of the human animal. So, if you have thoughts about monkey dicks, give us a call with your stories and your questions. We're at 512-991-9242 or tiny.cc/callsex because the show is coming right now. All right. Well, I'm a little bit overexcited, but before we get too into it, what's got you turned on so far tonight? What's got you revved up this week?
Oh man, I've got like so many cool things I'm working on right now. It's final season. I'm about to put out the last episode of the Evolution series over on my channel, which I'm stoked to death about. But more than most things, it's really just in my heart and in my feels at this moment is that my wife and I blew it on Christmas and gave each other all of our presents early because we can't help but do that. And this is one of the things she gave me. It's so sweet. It's a little jar of pills and it says love on there. And if you open the jar up and pull the little pills out, every one of the little pills had a little smiling face on it and they're real cute. And you can crack these little pills open and every single one of them, oh my gosh, dropping little pieces. Every single one of the little pills has a little scroll inside. And every single one of the scrolls, you open it up and you unfurl it, and they have little love notes on them. This one says boobs. And that's just this little thing she wrote.
That is sweet? Goddamn delightful.
So there's little, like 100
Dr.
of them in there.
Mario love notes. That is absolutely adorable.
Dr. Mario was exactly what I thought of when I first saw it.
Right? That's the color, sure.
It's just so sweet.
Yeah.
Love her to pieces.
You've definitely got me beat. I know people are already bored with my dumb takes on the cool movies of the moment. I just very briefly want to mention Bones and All, which is in theaters right now. It's the follow-up from the director of Call Me by Your Name, Lucas Guadagnino. It is a bizarre and interesting take on, I want to say, homosexuality in the 80s, but not in the way that you might think. It's a lot of fun. I would love for anybody out there listening to this to catch that movie, to call in the show, because honestly, I just want to nerd out about movies with you good folks.
Bones and All was so freaking weird. I loved all of it. I
dug it.
Just sitting in the theater and just like kind of just kind of confused what it was going to be. And then that first scene with her at the party, my face just lit up. I was just so like, oh my God. Like,
you knew there was going to be one of those moments, but it did come at like when you weren't ready for it.
Exactly. No idea what was going to happen. And it just hit me. It was the same thing with Barbarian. It was so original and so strange. Oh my God, I love that so much.
Yeah. Well, I would love for folks to check that out. But let's dive into this conversation because I know we've got more than enough to talk about tonight. This is the type of shit that I love to geek out on. I guess to set the table a little bit, about 10 years ago, everyone in my field of counseling and sexuality got really excited about a book called Sex at Dawn by Dr. Christopher Ryan that used biology and anthropology and archaeology and paleontology and all of these different fields to paint like a really radical picture of what human sexuality may have looked like before the cognitive revolution and before we started like writing all of this shit down.
Mhm.
And I fell in love with so many of the ideas in that book. And in the time since, a lot of people have really like turned on that book for being really speculative, for making a lot of assumptions beyond what the evidence can show us. So before we get any further tonight, can you talk to us just a little bit about how bioanthropology actually works and what it maybe
Yeah.
can and can't do?
Sure. So I haven't read that book in particular, so I'm not going to
Sure.
speak to that one. But I will say that bioanthropology is the science of humans. It's understanding humans from a biological perspective. So it's studying our anatomy and physiology. It's studying our evolution. It's studying our behaviors. Everything about what it means to be a human being for the past, however many million years you want to go back and draw the line. And so that's what bioanthropology is all about. But anthropology as a whole, the whole field of studying humans, also encompasses cultural anthropology and linguistics and talking about the way that we have behaved presently and also throughout history. And that ties into archaeology, digging up old people and looking up what were they doing and what can they tell us about our past and our present. There's this whole concept of middle range theory, of trying to draw analogies between the past and the present and the past to understand it. And so all of these different subfields of anthropology are intrinsically tied together. They, like I said before, they tell us what it means to be human. And what it can do is give us a tremendous amount of insight into how to be a human better. It helps us to eradicate ethnocentrism, and it helps us to kind of take ourselves down off of the pedestal a little bit, biologically speaking, and see ourselves for the animals that we are. What it can't do, and what a lot of people are surprised that again, is that you don't get to just open the book of humans and be like, oh, and they used to do it this way. Here you see this culture had these pots, and this pot was broken over here, and that means they must have not liked that pot very much, and that tells us now about this part of their culture. There's a huge amount of interpretation, and it gets criticized sometimes because it sounds a little bit like fantastical storytelling, that you're going to look back at these bones and pot shards and stone tools and whatever else and put together not only the habits but the whole cultural belief systems of these people. But it's no difference than any other science. You're just putting the facts that you have in order. And so when we go back and look at the fossil record of humanity, so to speak, we find not only this cavalcade of incredible worldviews, we also see our own worldviews as researchers being put onto that data, and we see problems come out of that. And so like now, especially over the past, I want to say like probably 20 years in anthropology, people have been going back and noticing like, hey, these puritanical Victorian dudes doing this early research maybe didn't have the best interpretation, and also maybe covered some stuff up that they weren't supposed to. The fact that feminist theory, the idea that women have been around for all of history and did things, that's a very recent development, surprisingly recent. So yeah, that's what it can and can't do, is that it can and can't tell us. It can tell us a lot about who we are, but it's not a magic spell. You know what I mean? It can't just give us everything we need to know. It still requires us to do science, to do experimentation, to try to understand who we are on a deeper level than just what we can see on the surface.
Yeah, one of the most interesting classes I ever took in university was comparative psychology. And in the very first opening lecture, the professor explained that basically comparative psychology doesn't work. Like the notion of trying to study animals in order to understand humans is sort of based on a flawed assumption. And I know we're going to get into it a little bit tonight, but it is such a tempting idea to be able to say like, well, these apes do this and those apes do that, and therefore humans must whatever. Yep. So I guess from that perspective and with all of those caveats, how unique are humans really? I mean, when you look at us compared to other primates and then compare those primates to one another, how much do we stand out? I mean, obviously we're doing something different. We've got satellites and bikinis and frozen food and all kinds of crazy shit.
Those are all great things.
Are
Those
good
are all
things.
yeah. So it's yeah. So you're right. You know, when we look at like comparative anatomy or something like that, that's a hugely useful tool for understanding things like paleontology. But comparative psychology, when you're looking at this stuff, like yeah, there are some lines you can draw, and there are some things we can see that definitely aren't uniquely human, like compassion and empathy, and you know all these different things we think are so much just us are definitely out there in the animal kingdom. But there are a lot of things that make us unique. Not all of them are particularly within the scope of this show, but like they're out there. For example, you know, control of fire. That's a human thing. And when I say human, I should point out that like the term human applies to anything in the genus Homo. So anything for the past 2.6 million years in our lineage would be a human. So you have Homo erectus, Homo neanderthalensis, Homo nadeli, Homo naledi, pardon me, Homo habilis. All of these things are different species of humans. So sustained control the use of fire, that's a human thing. Building boats, that's been around for a million or so years. That's a human thing. Language is a human thing. The kind of tool use that we talk about when we talk about humans is very, because like other apes and some other monkeys, they'll like use stones to crack nuts. Chimpanzees use little balls of moss to soak up water to drink water easily, or they use a twig to fish for termites. That is tool use, but it's not nearly to the level of like what an late Australopithecine or early Homo would be doing to crack stones together. And so like, yeah, there's a lot of things that make us unique. Behaviorally, that's all of those. Also, morphometrically, we could talk about like we have a reduced canine and no diasterna. That's a cool thing that we've got going on. We've got a hyoid bone. That's a cool thing we've got going on. The way that we give birth, the way that we are bipedal and constantly, the way that we walk, the muscle attachments or the muscles that develop because of that. Penis bones is one that we're going to talk about a lot. That's a unique one for us. We don't have one of those. So like there's a huge amount of things that separate us. But really what's more interesting to me is that when we look at like all the things that you want to talk about today about sex, we tend to fall weirdly in the middle. And we're strange outliers in all the weirdest, most nonsensical ways. So
that roadmap for understanding ourselves is pretty murky.
Yeah, it's really difficult. And that's the thing. When we talk about human evolution, one of the biggest frustrations that people have when they're learning about it is that it's not nearly as cut and dry as we like to pretend. You see that Zallinger diagram with the monkey that levels up and turns into a human.
Yeah.
Like 5
well,
years
why are there still monkeys, Forrest?
Right, exactly. And that's the kind of questions that shit breeds, because you see that and you're like, oh, well, that's easy. It was this, and then it was this, and it was this. And no, it's this tangled, crazy bush of things. And, it's different species popping in and out. And we're not entirely 100% sure which one preceded the other one exactly. And maybe these two are kind of interbreeding and we didn't think they were, but it looks like they are. And like, it's way more soupy and weird than what it's supposed to be in our heads. And our sexuality and sexual behaviors and sexual phenotypes are all very much the same thing. Our morphological characteristics, our behavioral characteristics regarding sex are fucking strange, man. I love it.
Yeah, well, so we wanted to get into at least 3 specific things tonight: concealed ovulation, persistent breasts, and big boneless human penises. Those things in particular, are those rare, very rare compared to other primates or even other mammals?
Yeah, all of those are weird as shit. So like
Fantastic.
so we'll start with concealed ovulation, because I know that was one that you were particularly excited about as well. Was this? So when we look at a lot of other primate species, you have it's very clear when you're an estrus, when you are ready to become impregnated, and they'll have this sexual swelling is what it's called, where the labia or the vulva or even the perineal area will become engorged and brightly colored. And like, this is very clearly, this female is ready to mate now. She is now producing eggs, or she's dropped an egg. She's ready to go. Humans don't do that. We still have the same estrus cycle, but we don't show it. And there are little things that you can tell, like there's little traceable things when a woman is ovulating. We see like a tiny increase in vocal pitch or a tiny scent change or whatever, like these little things, a small amount of swelling or something like that, but it's nothing even close to what could be like noticeably perceived generally, you know, and it's certainly nothing even close to other primate species. And so what's cool about this is that, you know, in early terms, or in early evolutionary thought, people thought that every single thing had to have had an adaptive purpose, that
Sure.
everything single thing on an animal or a plant or whatever, and every part of an organism must have evolved that way intentionally, so to speak.
For a reason.
Exactly, yeah, and that just isn't the case. A lot of, like, there's several examples of when that isn't the case, where either there is no selection pressure for or against something, that's just not a factor in your environment, and so whether you keep it or lose it, or it becomes, you know, enriched or depleted or more or less of whatever, it doesn't really matter very much past a certain threshold. So you can just do whatever. And so you end up with all sorts of things where it's just, eh. Also,
I mean, is
there's
that
what's
just
called,
random chance? It just so happens that certain things,
yeah,
even though there wasn't pressure on them, continued to propagate?
yeah. So like there's a thing like mosaic evolution, for example, where different parts, different structures can evolve at different rates at different times to all come together to be one type of thing. And that usually is something where there's a term called an exaptation, where something evolved for one purpose and then is reutilized for a different purpose later on. So like in that way, you could point to the position of our foramen magnums and the shapes of our spines and the bichondrial angle of our knees and the shapes of our feet and the shapes of our pelvises and all these individual things, and say, yes, all these function together for bipedal walking. But if you picked any one of them, it'd be kind of weird. And if you notice the fact that they all evolved at different rates over different points in our evolutionary history, they all came together to make bipedal walking the thing, and each of them was useful, or at least not harmful at the time that they happened. But like if you were to go back and try to trace the changing of the foramen magnum, the hole in the back of your skull, you can go all the way back to Sahelanthropus, you know, 7 or 8 million years ago, and say, okay, well, that thing has a really low foramen magnum. It was surely walking upright. But you know, right after that, you have like Ardipithecus, which had the same damn foramen magnum and had totally different feet shaped. And so like that doesn't work. So that's kind of what we look at with things like this is sometimes there just isn't a particular selection pressure for one particular thing, but that doesn't mean it isn't important, and that doesn't mean it doesn't stick around and it doesn't serve a purpose and have something, but it's just maybe not a thing that's evolution is acting on at that moment. Trying not to make evolution sound like a causation too much.
I hear that.
Yeah, but and then also there's spandrels, which is a whole other fuck you that evolution gives us. A spandrel is a concept came up with by this really great biologist named Stephen Jay Gould. And you and I were talking about him. I don't remember if it was before the show or at the beginning of the show, so I'm just going to explain. He's a really important evolutionary biologist. He's a guy who came up with the concepts like punctuated equilibrium, for example. And Stephen Jay Gould talked about spandrels. A spandrel is when you're building arches in like a church or an old classical architecture, whatever. You have these big arches, and in the middle of the arch, in between each one, there's a little triangle there between the two arches. And very often they became decorated and they were all beautified and ornate. And people, you know, if you asked, why did you put that triangle in there? I didn't. It was there because the arches are there. The arches being there made the triangle, and I just turned the triangle into something because it was there anyway. That's a spandrel. And so evolutionarily, you have things that like I didn't, you know, we don't need a chin. The chin doesn't have an evolutionary purpose, but the reduction of our jaws and the shape of our heads and the reduced prognathism, this flattening of our faces, those things all came together to produce a chin that does fucking nothing. But it's there, and it has a muscle attachment here. There's a muscle called mentalis, which all it does is this. It grumps your chin up. It has no purpose whatsoever, but besides grumping the chin. And like that's a spandrel. It's something that just is there because other things are there. And we see that same kind of thing when we talk about sex and sexuality in humans. Like it's hard to tell what's a spandrel, what's a leftover, what's just something that's weird that didn't necessarily have any negative selection pressure, so it stuck around. Like
These
it's
are the
all just
ingredients
kind
we
of up in the
have.
air.
It's not necessarily a recipe. It's just this is what we have, and whatever we
Yeah,
want to
we
cook with
dump the covered
from
in the
that.
bowl. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I mean, kind of generally speaking, I mean, what does it mean for a mammal to have concealed versus unconcealed ovulation? How do we interpret that when we are looking at other animals?
I forgot that's what we were talking about. So
Yeah. Yeah, well, I
sorry.
mean, like I remember when I was a kid, our we had a female dog that was not spayed, and
Mhm.
instead of handling that, we just gave our dog all of my little brother's little kid like Spider-Man underoos to wear around the neighborhood. In case anybody's wondering, like how I ended up becoming a sex therapist and having to work out some of this stuff, but my parents told me it was because when our dog was in heat we wanted to make sure not to tempt all of the other neighborhood dogs.
Yikes.
So,
Yeah.
humans, a little bit different. How do we
Big
interpret that?
surprise. That wouldn't have helped.
Yeah.
It turns out, aside from being a mechanical barrier, I guess. But
Right.
like,
Yeah.
yeah, but no, that's the thing is, when we talk about concealed versus unconcealed ovulation, lots and lots of species are they have either sexual swelling or they do a performative thing or whatever. Like they show on their bodies that they are now ready to mate. And there's countless primate species that have very much unconcealed ovulation. Or and so like you'll have like there's this one species of I can't remember the name off the top of my head, but they have these big red blisters that form all over their chests to show them that they're ready to go. Other ones that like I said, the vulva or the perianal area open up and blossom with this bright red. That's the whole point of erectile tissue. And humans, we don't do that with ovulation. We do that a little bit with like sexual arousal, not just talking about erectile tissue in like either a penis or a clitoris or with nipples, but like sometimes you'll have like flushing or something like that. Like we have
Mhm.
like some demonstrations that are kind of similar, but
More
nothing even in the
subtle than a
same
lot of these
vein.
creatures.
Yeah, and so when the whole point of me going off on that tangent about weird shit about evolution, I remember now what I was trying to say and I got lost. Was that the 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 reason for that for a long time we used to think that this was to protect females, that females didn't give off this any kind of indication that they were ready to go because they didn't want to be assaulted, they didn't want to be in a dominated relationship, they were trying to like protect themselves and like they could make a female selecting choice or something like this. And there's just not a huge amount of evidence for that.
Mm.
And more like it's looking like we have these we have concealed ovulation not because it's an advantage, but because it isn't enough of a disadvantage to do anything different. And
Mm.
like it just we are very much a very minimally sexually dimorphic species where we're not quite as undimorphic as bonobos, certainly not as dimorphic as like gorillas, but we're just kind of this in the middle where there's a little bit of dimorphism, but not enough to have these big displays, not enough for any of that stuff. And we've clearly had some level of society for at least a million or 2 years. So, like, there's just not necessary to have these kinds of social cues, these kind of, displays like that.
Yeah, so there is not a strong theory or a lot of pressure on the idea that this is tied at all to monogamy,
No,
or toward pair bonding or anything along those lines.
no, not that I can tell, or at least not that I've heard. If there is, I haven't heard of it, and it's not saying much. But like
Yeah, well, you're
the
clearing
idea,
up some of the misconceptions that I think a lot of folks, yeah, I mean, from the book that I mentioned at the very beginning, but I think I definitely see in other places when we talk about evolutionary psychology anyway, that's a really common narrative.
yeah, and so like you have like for example, um, this is a huge question in bioanthropology is how should humans be having sex? How
Sure.
should we be mating? Like what's like the natural quote way to do things? And we look out and there's a million different markers that we're gonna surely touch on more and more as the show goes on. But like there's a million different indicators of like whether a species is going to be like a tournament species where you have the dominant male with like this harem, or they're going to be like a multi-male, multi-female society thing like we have going on, or if they're more isolated and solitary, or like if they're polygynic where you're going to have one male with a bunch of females, or polyandric with one female with a bunch of males. Like what different model are we looking at when we look at all these other primates with all these different models? Which one do humans really fit into? And pretty much consistently on every single one of these markers, we find that we are either smack dab in the middle of where we're supposed to, where everything else is,
Yeah.
or we're way off to one side for no damn reason, and like in a very clearly ridiculous way. So like, for example, one thing I know you're excited to talk about is penises. You look at like penises in different ape species, and uh, uh, you talk about like the shapes and the sizes, and that, does that relate to sexual behavior? Well, chimpanzees and bonobos don't have a glans. They have like just really tapered penis. And so humans do. So we're like, okay, so that must be this new kind of apomorphic. This is a surprising thing that just came in recently, and it's very unique to us. And we can find reasons for that. That the swelling of the glands helps to pull out, create like a suction to remove competitors' sperm, and like we can find all this stuff. And okay, well, that doesn't really settle how bonobos and chimps are getting by then, if this is such a useful adaptation. Also, gorillas and orangutans have a glands, and they're less related to us than bonobos and chimps are. So what the fuck is that, right? It's
well,
supposed
and
to
not
be
competing in the same way, right?
yeah, and so like
just
completely
to pull some of this
orangutans
apart,
are isolated.
yeah,
And
I guess
gorillas are
I want to
tournament.
kind of explain to the audience a little bit. When you're talking about a glans, what we're getting at here is that there is a portion of the human penis that we have for a long time kind of believed was meant to act as like a plunger to basically pull out sperm from rivals. And you're suggesting that, now that we actually look more into that, maybe not. Do I have all that right?
I mean, that is one of the like the explanations that we have for its shape, but what we don't have a good explanation for is its evolutionary history. Like it's
Sure.
just kind of weird, because like usually when you draw a cladogram, when you try to build evolutionary relationships, we look for the most parsimonious relationship based on the adaptations at hand. And so you say, here's this species 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and they have adaptations A, B, C, D, E. And if these species all have this adaptation and this one doesn't, then it makes more sense to say this one has this ancestor, and then that adaptation evolved, and then these other species evolved afterwards, than it does to say this adaptation came in and then it went away and then it came back and then it was, like that kind of, that's a crazy,
Yeah.
but that's exactly what we see with this kind of like with this particular thing. And that's not impossible. Like I can give you a million examples of that happening, but that's like supposed to be your last option of like building the family tree. And if we were only trying to build the family tree based on penises, it would look very differently than the way it does based on genetics and everything else that we have. And another thing is really interesting to think about is testicle size, because penis size is one thing, but like when we look at the size of testicles, it's another thing that you can usually use that as like this proxy to try to gauge the mating habits of especially a primate species. If it has really big testicles, then it's probably going to have this big dominant alpha male that needs to have lots of babies and be able to reproduce a whole bunch. And if it has really small testicles, there's probably a low degree of sexual dimorphism and they're better parents and all this stuff. And generally speaking, that kind of tracks. And generally speaking, humans fall right the fuck in the middle. And also, gorillas, which are like the classic example of the big mean tournament species harem having primate, has like the smallest penis and the smallest testicles of like anybody in our immediate family tree. So you know what I mean? Like a gorilla's penis is a fraction of the size of a human's, and it's the same thing with their testicle size. It's tiny. So why? Well, how does that make any sense? It's just, primates are just so freaking strange, dude. And I'm sure that there's a primatologist out there that's beating their head against a book right now. Like, well, actually, there was this study that's out there. I haven't read it, but I'm just saying, like, we're weird in these ways. And when we look at, when we look at ourselves in the big picture, like you're asking, we tend to just be bizarre. We either fall right in the middle, or like with penis size, we have the biggest penises to body ratio out of any other primate. Go us. And we have no clue as to why. We're also like the only primate species without a penis bone. Almost every other primate has a bacillum, and so we're the only ones without bacilla. And yet we have a very large penis that stays erect for a very long time without the support structure that other apes and other primates with smaller, less long-term erections have to maintain. Why?
Yeah. So the notion that a gorilla, for instance, would sort of put their evolutionary chips, and I know that we're really, really like anthropomorphizing the will of evolution, but the kind of popular theory that gorillas got big and sort of focused their energies in that sense on being able to compete in these different ways externally for mates, as opposed to like internal competition where it is a sperm war between different males that have also mated with the same female.
Yeah.
Is there grounding for that? I know that I'm poorly summarizing something, but is there any validity to
No,
those ideas in the first place?
you're just fine. And the thing is, like, number one, there's there's lots of ways that males compete besides just trying to suction out the sperms of other ones, like in
Or beating
gorillas
the
in
shit
particular.
out of each other in these like
Yeah,
tournament ways
exactly.
that we're
Yeah.
discussing?
Yeah, and in gorillas in particular, you have the tournaments where they fight for dominance, and also when a new male gorilla becomes the dominant one, the first thing he does is go and murder all of the baby gorillas so that they're all dead, and now only his babies will be present. So they have this infanticide coded into their behaviors as well. So like there's lots of ways that can happen, but like what's tricky is that it's really hard to tell the difference between sexual selection. This was this bigger penises were nicer, or it worked out this way, that this was a thing that we wanted, we went for, versus the spandrel, where it's something that this didn't really have a reason to be this way, it just kind of was, versus again something that just lacked selection pressure, and so it developed that way and it worked out, versus having an adaptation that was lost and then came back, which again is rare, but it happens. It's just not something that we have the data to be able to put a pin in right now. And everything that at least that I've read about this is very much either criticizing other studies for not having the data that they need, or just reaffirming the fact that the ball is still in the air. And we see this with with genitalia sizes, with behaviors, with the whether we're monogamous or polyamorous throughout our lives. Humans tend to be serially monogamous, which is weird. We're not always perfectly pair bonded. Even the way that we talk about relationships today, the idea that you should not only have a romantic relationship with your partner, but that romantic relationship should persist, and that love and feelings and romance and courtship and all these things should be persistent throughout your relationship. If you went back 50 years, nobody would know what you're talking about. Like that's a very, very new concept.
Yeah.
And yet today, you and I, like that would be, I wouldn't want to live any other way. You know what I mean?
Sure.
And so like everything from physiology to behavior with humans is a little bit unorthodox, and we just don't have the data we need to say we fit in this particular sexual niche within the primate clade. It doesn't work that way.
Yeah, it's worth taking at least a moment to kind of note what you're saying about how new that notion of the one partner, and how many roles, how many hats you're expected to play in that relationship, how new that is. Esther Perel in particular talks a lot about this, and I really encourage people to take a look at some of her writing, because we get so frustrated and fed up when the spark is gone from our relationship, and you never look me in the eyes anymore when you kiss my lips, and like we feel so frustrated that our partners aren't always and forever our best friend and the sexiest person we've ever met and the most romantic person we could possibly be around. I mean, I certainly think of my partner as embodying so many of those things, but I think we twist ourselves into knots getting frustrated at how we aren't perfectly fulfilling all of these roles that up until rather recently we would never have expected from another human being. I mean, is that all fair to say as far as
Absolutely,
you understand
it? Yeah, that's the thing. The relationships that we have are culturally driven. You know what I mean? Like there's still, I talk about our expectation of people. What I mean is, the Western global North is what I'm talking about. You know what I mean? Because like there's still countless cultures all over the world where marriage is a thing of political status. It's a thing of economics. It's a thing of convenience. It's a thing of just focused on reproduction. One of our homework assignments when I first started college and we were taking as a this early American history course. One of our homework assignment was go talk to your parents and your grandparents and your great grandparents if you have them. Ask the oldest people you can find, how did your husband propose to you? And see where you'll notice this shift between will you marry me, which is what we would say now, versus a couple of generations back it would have been will you have my children. That was the main focus of marriage. That was the point. And like that today, if I had asked Amber, will you have my children, as the way to get, she probably wouldn't have had the same response. And so like that's because that's just that's such a weird thing to approach somebody with at this day and age. And so like, when the way that we see relationships, the way that we handle relationships, the way that the expectations that we have on each other, in terms of marriage and family and all these things, they're constantly shifting, and they should. And I encourage everybody to evaluate what you actually want out of a partner, and don't be tied down to what you think you should want, and be willing to find somebody who's as weird as you. Amber and I, we got married on our 10-year anniversary. She's my best friend, and she always has been, and she always will be. And like, that's like, we were more than compatible, living together, sharing everything together way before we got married. And the marriage was just like, you know what? Shit, dude, if I die right now, you don't get the things. So like, we should probably make this happen to get the paperwork done. You know what I mean? So like, that's not to say it isn't romantic and wonderful and happy, but we were already romantic and wonderful and happy. So
right,
like,
sure.
do that. Don't find somebody who's your best friend that you also want to sleep with. That's fine. You know what I mean? That's fine. You don't have to make
it's a functional dynamic, but again, not prescriptive, right? Because
exactly.
It's probably not what the vast majority of humans have done over the course of time.
Not at all.
Yeah. So we can kind of invent our own culture here, and this idea that our function should follow our biological form is at best messy.
Yeah, exactly. Is that this? It's the same thing. Not to get to twist too many crossroad wires, but like, it's the same thing when we talk about sex and gender, which I think was the last time I was on here for it. Is that those are very different things, and no matter what we pin down about biological sex, no matter what we learn about it, it doesn't do shit for the cultural construct of gender. And the fact that changes from generation to generation, from culture to culture, from person to person, from day to day. And like, that's a totally different dynamic of how a person presents themselves, and the performance that they put on of what their gender is, and the way that they play that out in their lives. It's the same thing in relationships. We can, as much as we want, we can say, oh, okay, well, these monkeys do this and these apes do that. And they can tell us a lot about our biology as a human. And that's fantastic. Does it change shit for the fact that, like, I want this person for a totally different reason than you might want your person, for a totally different reason that this other person might want 3 people for, you know what I mean? So it's all about, if you're an adult and you're all consenting, go for it. And that should
stop worrying about the supposed tos and the shoulds, and just find your happiness.
Yep, precisely. I guarantee my relationship wouldn't work out for a lot of other people, and I guarantee their relationships wouldn't work out for me. Do your own thing, dude.
Well, before we jump onto the phone lines, I did want to ask you a little bit more about this idea of persistent breasts. That is not something I was previously familiar with, and I guess I'm interested to know human breasts, what makes them special beyond just being awesome.
Right.
Sorry, I don't mean to be like overly much of like a straight-ish dude, but I just have to ask.
No, I agree. Not only as someone who's at least mostly straight, but also as somebody who just is a person. They're wonderful things, and that's something that we should all be able to agree upon. Left, right, gay, straight, Christian.
We can all come together around.
We can all come together on this one point. But like, no, that's the weird thing about human breasts, is that they're there all the time. So like, when you look at other primate species, when they are pregnant, they develop breasts, and then they have a baby, they breastfeed, the baby gets weaned and goes away, and their breasts reduce and they're back to normal. Humans don't do that. We develop breasts at the beginning of puberty, so usually around age 10 to 12, and there you start to develop breasts, and then they stay with you your whole life. And they sometimes, like, they do engorge more during pregnancy. Sometimes during arousal they might swell or firm a little bit, but like, beyond that, they're just fucking there, and they cause back problems, and they get in the way, and they're hot and sweaty, and there are all sorts of problems with them, but they're still there all the time. And here's a fun fact: we have no idea why. There's been countless studies on this, and we can't.
So that's my next question. We really don't have much. I mean, are there leading theories? Like,
go to Google Scholar and type in persistent breasts and prepare to be bored out of your mind. There's nothing on it, because and there have been a million hypotheses. Generally, people talk about, it's probably sexual selection. and it's like we just like it. But there's
We
no
just like it.
actual, yeah, we just like it. But there's no actual indicator for that. There have been actual like morphometric studies comparing breast size and hip size and estrogen levels and like attractiveness, and we can't find a correlation that it fits across all across all cultures. And you can look at, just across the, our culture here in America. Back in the 1920s, you wanted the flappers, the flat-chested, boyish, boxy frame, very androgynous looking. Now thick is back, and thank God for that. And like there's all sorts of like everything in between. And you look back at other cultures where having some stomach rolls was seen as incredibly sexy because that meant that you were healthy and well fed. And then other cultures where you have that heroin chic little stick skeleton people, and if you have a thigh gap, that's what you're looking for. There's just no consistent thing where we can verify this sexual selection hypothesis. It doesn't work. And so there are a million other hypotheses, from, giving something a baby to hold on to and cling to for like years past when they're supposed to be weaned. Okay, maybe, but that doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. Thermoregulation was one of the more modern hypotheses. The idea that it would keep a woman warm at night because they have generally less body fat around the middle. Oh, well, who knows? Yeah, that doesn't really track, considering we don't have body fat on our chest. Men tend to deposit body fat in our stomachs and the back of our necks. Women tend to deposit body fat, obviously, in their breasts, but also in their thighs and hips and waist. And so they thought that maybe this difference in like fat depositing that worked out. Doesn't really work that way either. It doesn't really tie to fecundity, the ability to have children. There's no real consistent thing there. So like that doesn't really work. There's just, every time we look for a reason, the reason comes up with nothing. And so we have no idea why women have boobs all the time. And also, here's another weird thing. You and I have mammary glands as well that can very easily, given the right hormone balance, can develop and become fully functional. Why? And that's and there's this we come back to this again, this spandrel hypothesis. Male nipples are potentially another spandrel that, well, the females needed them, and so the males just got them. And like that doesn't really track. It's kind of a bullshit cop out when you think of it. And so like it's we have no idea. It's one of the many, many mysteries of human sexuality. And I have another good one for you after. I know you got to do the thing, so like go for your ad read, and then I have another.
Well, no, we've got a couple of things to check in on. I guess before we jump on the phones and take these other steps, I just want to comment very briefly. We had a great conversation with Emma Thorne a couple of weeks ago about red pill culture and the manosphere and the alpha male theory and some of these things. And I mean, you know that a lot of this like social Darwinism is just bullshit on its face. Yeah. But it is just so interesting to me to be able to say, like, these brilliant scholars are writing these desperate papers, basically unable to explain any of these things. So I appreciate that you and I hear people, experts, quote unquote, on the internet trying to talk about some of this stuff. But if you find yourself in a, on a Reddit thread or in a 4chan forum or something along those lines, and you start getting concrete, definite answers about the human animal and about what is attractive and how, people are always going to be attracted to this particular type of person. And there are these different leagues of people. It's all just such bullshit as soon as you start to scratch the surface on the intellectualism and the scholastic nature of those ideas. And I guess I just want to continue to bang that gong as loudly and as often as we can.
The worst one that I hear all the time is that sexual selection is defining women as being whores. If they sleep with more than one guy, then it's evolutionarily not right, and that men should be able to sleep with all the women. Is like, fuck
the
you.
gatekeeper versus sowing your wild oats. Yeah.
Yeah, it's all bullshit. It's all bullshit. And like it's the same thing as when people try to talk about trans people and they try to bring biology into it. Like, you don't know shit. It's so much weirder than you think, dude.
All right. Well, we are going to jump on the phones here in just a moment. We've had a few people call in and then get lost. So if we accidentally dropped your call, please give us another try. We do have lines open at 512-991-9242. But first, we're going to take a quick look at what's been going on around the rest of the ACA.
Interaction with people in the faith. It doesn't mean acceptance of everything that they believe,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Love
For
the
both.
theist, not the theism? Can we do that?
That's assured.
You've been, I think, our #1 repeat caller for this show this year.
Yeah, and there's some people who don't like that. They say they're sick of the sound of my voice. So to those people, nah.
All the parents out there, talk to your kids. Understand what they're learning. And if you don't like what they're learning, they still have to get a passing grade. So teach them what you want them to know at home. At home.
You love to come on and you love to really obfuscate and pontificate and other large words so that I get closer to my J-Mike transformation.
Final form. Because we all know that Islam is true, right?
But they're not authorized by God. They're created by man.
It says in their book that they are.
I could write a book and say that this is God speaking. That's different from
exactly. Yes! You just hit the nail on the head, dude. That's exactly right.
Okay, well, we're going to get started with Kat in London, who is, I suppose, coming to terms with her gender identity. Kat, what can we help you with tonight?
Hi, I'm. It's been a crazy year for me, and
Sure.
You guys, I love you guys, both of you. Every time you're on, you're awesome, and I just wanted to drop regarding the conversation before. It reminds me of a quote from the book *Sapiens* by Yuval Noah Harari, where he says, biology enables, culture forbids. Right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So basically, whatever your body can do, you can do. And it's the society that tells you not to do the thing that you want to do.
Sure.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Society kind of constricts or tells us prescriptively like how to and how not to use that body. No, that's a fair point.
So I've been realizing things about me over this last year or so. Like, for instance, I just received a diagnosis for ADHD, which explains a lot in my life. In my very late 40s. But I also find myself having realized how much of the social script I've been following. Like that one time I went to a church dance in drag and was shamed horribly. I was like, oh, well, this isn't acceptable. So I guess I'm just going to now get married and have kids. And well, I love my kids. And I love my partner. She doesn't understand that I've always felt like wrong. I think, Christy, you said a long time ago, well, not that long ago, that, you don't notice your shoes when they fit right. And
Sure.
I've been thinking an awful lot about my shoes lately.
Yeah. No, I hear that. What kinds of things are showing up for you right now? As you kind of give yourself permission and make a little bit of space for these feelings that you've maybe wanted to shove down or that have been really inconvenient to your life. And I'm sorry to use that term, but these issues that you haven't been able to make space for before, now that you're sitting with them, what's showing up?
Well, it's really funny. It's just like the floodgates open. Like I realized one of my very earliest memories. There's that theory that some of your earliest memories are associated with traumas, and mine was when my mom hit me. She hit me for dressing up in her clothes when I was a very, very little person. And it's like, oh, I guess that's not okay. And just remembering seeing things on TV and going, why am I a boy and not a girl? I want to be a girl. And, enjoying, like when I was a teenager, the only time I got a chance to really dress in the way I felt was like when I got to go to the midnight showing of the Rocky Horror Picture Show. And I just cherished those moments, right? But then it's like, but this isn't, back when I was doing that was, like 30 years ago, right? So I didn't really have the words. I didn't have the understanding to express this, because back then a lot of things were just like, oh, you're weird, you're strange, you're not normal. Just so get on with it. So realizing that I am, in my gender expression, I realize I am very much at least queer, if not wanting to express more toward the femme. With my sexuality, I'm absolutely queer. All of these things that are coming feeling.
Yeah, Kat, I'm going to interrupt you just because your phone call is cutting out a little bit, so I'm having a little trouble following what you're saying at this stage. But I hear you, and I don't know what you were exactly looking for from us tonight, but I just appreciate your willingness to share this with us. And I suppose I want to tell you that it is a heartbreaking tragedy to think about the years that you lost, or the opportunities that you didn't get to have, and the fact that you weren't able to, wear a prom dress or a wedding dress, or some of these different things at those junctures in life. But I also want to say that even as you're coming to these ideas now, it's not like a flip gets switched and all of a sudden you get to spend the rest of your life being, quote, the real you. But all of these things are just passing moments, and you have every opportunity to make the next moment and the moment after that and every future moment into anything that you'd like it to be. Let's see if we're got a little bit better connection. Are you hearing me now? All right. Well, hopefully we will hear more from Kat later tonight. For now, Forrest, what do you say we jump in with Stephen in Arizona, who wanted to talk a little bit more about concealed ovulation?
Yeah, that sounds fine. I would also like to just say to Kat, just to say, if she's still listening, just building a little bit off of what you said, one of the biggest things when you're studying cultural anthropology is this idea of gender performance, and it's the idea that gender isn't just something that you are, it's something that you do. And so it's you have the opportunity, like Christy just said, to do the gender that you want,
Yeah.
to be the thing you want, even if whatever you identify, however people talk to you, whatever, like, you get to put on the performance of the gender that you like the most, and have that mean whatever it means to you. And if you really want, you can kind of look back over your life and maybe find some instances when you did that anyway, even if you weren't thinking about it, even if you didn't know it. I know it's not exactly a comparison, but I look back over my life and I notice things about my career and my life's plan and everything today that I didn't realize were just innately, I couldn't help, but they were coming out of myself. And so, like,
Yeah.
I find that, if you look at gender in terms of performance, you might find some things about yourself that maybe has always been with you, and maybe you can find some happiness there, and then some hope for the future as well. Maybe that'd be a cool thing. I don't know.
Yeah. And as Kat was talking about a recent ADHD diagnosis, I might also mention just the episode that we did around the idea of neuroqueering, or really just spending some time Googling that idea, because it is that notion of gender as a performance, but also our masking or our neurotypicality, or however we want to slice these things. It is all just a form of acting, and we get to choose kind of what role we want to play.
Absolutely. That's a great way to put it.
So let's talk to Stephen in Arizona, who had more questions about concealed ovulation. Stephen, go for it.
Hi. So, as Forrest, it's lovely to talk to you and everything. I consume your content elsewhere, so it's very exciting for me to get to ask you this. Or I didn't know it was going to be this question, but here we go. So, as you were talking about concealed ovulation, I was reminded of an article I read probably 20 years ago about the idea of penis size and breast persistence coming from the fact that we finally stood upright and could see these things until we put on clothes. And I was thinking about the same thing with respect to concealed ovulation, is that once we were standing upright, the vulva wasn't visible. So, or if memory serves, it's not typically. So and I've heard about, I think it's a species of baboon or bonobo, where when the males greet each other, they reach out and touch someone. They wank each other to say hello, which is something I think we gave up on a little too quickly in evolution. But yeah, so my where I'm going with this is I'm wondering if overall our sexuality isn't an expression of the fact that we can't tell when a woman is ovulating just to look at her. So if there's access and she's receptive, males are just sort of, let's go for it. Because we're to Christy's earlier point about his dog, we grow up with this idea that if a woman's or a female's in estrus, the males of that species are going to lose their minds trying to get to her to mate. And we don't do that. And it kind of, I know homosexuality and other expressions exist across other species, but it seems to me that it kind of opened it up to not only how we interact heterosexually, but in other ways, because we're not necessarily worried about that. That isn't, it might be at the very bottom of the basest of our instinct to say this is the possible result, but because we can't tell, we just go for it. And I just wondered what your thoughts were on that possible hypothesis before I write a paper.
So you just gave me like an hour's worth of stuff to talk about. So I'm going to try to get through it quickly and like go piece by piece. And no, you're fine. That's such a huge amount of things you just said. So first of all, in terms of like, the signaling of us standing up and not being able to tell, that kind of this was a similar hypothesis about like why persistent breasts exist, is that this was supposed to imitate a buttocks, because in other primates they usually go from behind, and so your breasts are supposed to look similar enough to a butt to be sexy when we're having sex, like in a missionary position. And then there was another hypothesis that added on that like having large lips was supposed to look like a vulva as well, and like this whole like again, no real consistent evidence for these things that really, but like these are ideas that get tossed around.
I never quite understood that one. I definitely heard that one a lot. So I'm glad to have that at least a little bit sort of pushed back against.
I've never heard a single bit of actual quantifiable evidence. I've heard a lot of people say
boobs aren't just the front butt.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I've heard a lot of people say that. But again, there's plenty of things where they measure breast size and hip size and waist size and all these things and try to compare it to, cultural concepts of attractiveness. And we just don't, it doesn't work. And so what was I saying? Right. And so like that's a thing that's kind of up in the air. And then you talk about sexuality and like how we're gonna, go and have sex. Humans are, this is the worst word to describe humans. We are what are called persistent breeders, or continuous breeders. Pardon me. We are what are called continuous breeders. Other species are seasonal breeders, so they only have one set of time a year that they can get pregnant. And humans are continuous breeders, which, that's a harsh way to call a person. But we still do have an estrous cycle, so there's only actually about like maybe 3 to 7 days a window where a woman can actually get pregnant, even though she could potentially have sex the whole time. And so like that, it doesn't really, we can have sex whenever we want. But trying to tack that down with an evolutionary reason might not work, because there is also the option of it was nice. It felt good. We wanted to do it. And that's what we see like with bonobos, for example. They have sex to say hello. They have sex to say goodbye. They have sex to settle an argument. They have sex to celebrate the fact that the argument settled. It's all the time. And when we talk about the reasonings for these things, there are proximal answers and there are distal answers. So you take something like hiccuping, right? There's no immediate reason for that. There's no proximal explanation for hiccups. There's a distal explanation for hiccups, which is that, a little over 400 million years ago, our ancestors are still in the water, and this gulping behavior forced water over our gills and got extra oxygen. And so now we have this fixed action pattern, this reflex that causes this kind of thing to happen, even though we're well past it. This is a vestigial behavior. And so when we talk about sexual behavior in humans, we can look for a distal explanation and go, okay, so, a million and a half years ago during the early Pleistocene, when the climate in Africa was getting drier, and so we had to have sex this way to get across the savannah that way. And like, we can try to pull these things, or we can look for the proximal explanation, which is it felt good and we did it. And like, that's way more consistent. And we see that when we talk about sex for pleasure, or the pleasure of having sex when we're not supposed to, when we don't need to, when we're just doing whatever. Like, we see that not only in humans. Again, we can look out in the animal species and we see countless different examples of, like, anal sex, oral sex, non-penetrative genital stimulation, which is the fancy biology word to say masturbation. Like, we see all of these things. We even see indications, or at least hints of, like, what could be perceived as sexual fantasy. We see this baboon watches the big bad male baboon have sex with the head female, and then the head female walks by and he gets an erection, he goes behind a tree and he masturbates. And we, maybe you could find some, complex biochemical, the pheromones and the estrous cycle of that and the hormone signaling, or he saw what he wanted to be doing and he saw the sexy baboon chick and he went and knocked one out just for prosperity. Like, that's totally fine too. So it's really tough to put that's a great hypothesis. It's a great supposition you've got there, but I can't say that it's any better than just the explanation of, we felt like fucking, so we did. And that also ties into other things when we talk about, the weirdness of things like persistent breasts, and the weirdness of things like, our the penis shapes and all the things. One of these other weird things that you should take into account when you talk about something like this is the female orgasm. Why do females have orgasms? Men, the males don't really need it, but there's a lot more volume when we do, but like, all the biochemical things, all the endorphins and all that aren't really super necessary, but at least we can tie something to it. There is a notable quantifiable result of a male orgasm. But a female orgasm, what are we talking about there? What's the point of that? There's a very, 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 very slight increase in the possibility of fertilization that we can sometimes point to. But it's very obvious that it's not necessary for fertilization. It's not necessary for pregnancy. It's not necessary for implantation. It's not necessary to give birth. It's just, why? And we can call it a spandrel, just like male nipples. The men needed to have an orgasm, so the ladies got one too. Aren't they lucky? But that doesn't explain the fact that, like, clitoral orgasms are often way easier to achieve than a penetrative orgasm. So how does that make evolutionary sense if that's a thing? And again, just like with breasts, there's a huge amount of hypotheses for this, that this is something that causes this reaction that makes you more likely to have sex. One of the leading hypotheses for a long time about female orgasms was that it exhausts you so that you'll lay down flat and sperm don't have to fight up against gravity and it's more likely to get. But that doesn't really work, does it? In the majority of cases of sex, ask any random woman walking around, is that something that goes on most of the time, that this is the end result for you? So, like, it's one of those weird things, and I hate to fall back on this, but this is kind of the point of this whole show, is that this is one of those things where we can absolutely look to other animals, and we can absolutely look to other primates and find things that inform our understanding of our biology, but it does not inform our understanding of why or what's going on in these fine details. Humans are very weird for a lot of reasons.
Well,
so, Stephen, I don't know if that answers your question or just kind of murks it up a little bit more.
It should do both.
Yeah,
if
right.
I'm doing my job right, it should do both.
Yeah, it does. But I mean, it. I guess from my perspective, it's fascinating to think about. How long we've been here, how different we are from other primates in some ways, and how similar we are in others. And no, it's just fascinating to think about, because a lot of stuff doesn't make sense. Like the thing that bothers me the most, because of how it's affected people in my family, ironically, is how bad we are physically at doing certain things like giving birth. And with the women that I've been attracted to, for some reason, and I don't know if this is why or not, because we could have another discussion, but I like women with wide hips. And I don't know if that's some part of my brain saying she's more likely to deliver a baby successfully. But, my great or third great grandmother died shortly after childbirth because her hips were too narrow. And my mother almost died giving birth to my brother, which she loved to remind him of, and that I was the good son because I wasn't any problem. But in all seriousness, things like that, you talked about the back and different parts of the body that it doesn't make any sense that they work the way that they do. So it's just a fascinating thing to think about, and just makes us realize we're all okay. This is what we are and who we are and how we are, and just ride with it.
And that's a weird thing, is that it comes back to the cultural expectations and the cultural constructions of sexuality and of what we like to do. Christy can probably speak more to this than I can, but I know for sure that there's links, like if you grew up in poverty, you're more likely to like large breasts later on in life. And is that a thing where we can say that this is like some symbol of abundance, or is this some other weird thing? You know what I mean? The same way that if you were bullied as a child, you're less likely to have a committed relationship until a little bit later in life. Why is that a thing of disconnection and distrusting, or is that some other you know what I mean? So
and how would those numbers look if we were checking them on a different continent, or 50
Precisely.
years before or later, or whatever else?
Exactly. And so it's just not something that we can always point to, this equals that, therefore, you know what I mean? It's just not that easy.
And if I could just add one more thing real quick, my great grandparents, talking about social structures and so forth, they got married because they had to. He got her pregnant in 1880. And they got married right away to make the child legal or whatever. And then they had 7 more. And she let him have extramarital affairs. He was a well-known womanizer because she didn't, she already had 8 kids. And it was like, if we're going to have sex, we're going to have a kid. So we got to cut down on this. So she let him be outside of the relationship, having sex, not willy-nilly, but for lack of a better term, so that her life wasn't in danger, not just, because of the time period and everything, maternal mortality was higher and so forth. So the whole structure of relationships and how you negotiated that or navigated that had to be different before we had reliable birth control and ways of controlling family planning. So again, all of it, I love sociology and anthropology, so this is all very fascinating, and I appreciate you letting me ramble and answering my questions so completely. So thank you.
Hey, no worries. And just speaking to what you said, that's another thing that we talk about. When we talk about relationships, the vast majority of societies throughout history have been polygamous. You have one man and many women. The vast majority of relationships throughout human history have been monogamous, or I should say cultural history, or at least serially monogamous. And that this is one of those wonderful things that now in this day and age we're kind of getting more comfortable with talking about, is things like the fact that having different relationships, having different kinds of relationships has been around for forever. Kink and freaky sex has been around forever. These different opinions and beliefs on what a relationship should and shouldn't look like have been around forever. And now there are people who are pan and poly and all sorts of every other way. And it's open relationships, or what, it's as long as it works for you, it's cool. And we're coming back to that more and more and more, that as long as it is, like I said before, adults that are consenting, it's great. And it's probably happened before. And if we actually quantify what we would call unorthodox, out of the box, abnormal sexual relationship behaviors, it accounts for about 50% of all people. So we try, as especially with early anthropology and scientists, to come in and be like, oh, we're going to boil this down and knock off all the rough edges and try to get to the foundations of human sex and sexuality, and we end up eliminating half of the human population. And so it's just it's a wonderful thing that we get to go back and revisit these numbers and find out that they don't mean shit.
Yeah. So Stephen, I super appreciate you giving us a call. We're gonna keep getting into it, but thank you for raising all this.
Thanks so much, Stephen.
Thank you. Have a great evening. Bye-bye.
Take care.
Yeah, so there towards the end, y'all were really getting after what feels to me so important about having this conversation, which is that we live in a society and in a culture, and myself personally, growing up in a very small town, rural, evangelical type of worldview, it was there's the right way to do it and the wrong way to do it. And God's people have always tried to do it the right way with varying degrees of success, but it's always been that way. When in reality, what most of us think of as traditional family values is very much the minority across all time and culture, not just as we're discussing, proto-humans and ideas that span millions of years, but even if we look back to like the Leave It to Beaver 50s and things, across the pond, things were looking very, very different. Even here in America, things were looking very different from that story that we were telling ourselves. And all of this is not to be prescriptive. If you want 2.5 kids and a white picket fence, by all means, like, do that shit.
Sure.
But the notion that you are failing because you have not achieved, a marriage to your high school sweetheart with 2 children that lived happily ever after is just asinine. And we beat each other up and we heap so much shame on ourselves for failing to live up to a standard when that standard isn't even like a ideal worth striving for. It's just one equally important or unimportant way of being. I mean, how does all that grab you?
I completely agree. Is that we live in a society of people who are having their bi-monthly panic attack because they haven't had their kissing Jake Gyllenhaal in the rain at the other end of an airport terminal, that all that they haven't had this crazy moment that they saw in XYZ movie. And like, it's just because that's not it's not that isn't a real thing. It's just like, that's a very rare and not reasonable thing. And also you don't really need that. And also there's a lot of wonderful other things. And like, just people try to hold themselves to these weird standards. And when we look back, even across, there's this really cool sexologist. She is I'm gonna forget her name off the top of my head. It's like I'll give it to you later on, and if you can put it in something. But she just did a TED talk about this. She's fantastic, and she's on TikTok as well. And she does kinky history, and she talks about different people and throughout history. James Joyce, the one of the greatest writers of all history, the father of classical literature and all this stuff. She reads a poem that he wrote to his wife about how much she farted one evening and how hot it was. And your ass was full of farts, my little whore, and I fucked them all out of you. And like, he goes on to describe all of these different farts in all these beautiful flowery ways. And then Mozart had, he wrote songs about lick my asshole and all that, which you can call jokes, but probably weren't. And then, you've got Jean-Jacques Rousseau, one of the founders of the Enlightenment that we credit with the foundation of America and all this stuff. Jean-Jacques Rousseau wrote at length about his desire to be spanked and dominated by a woman dressed up as his mother. It wrote all about it because that was what he was into. And we just don't talk about that. We don't. And you can tie into one thing that I've talked about a few times before, and it happens to be in the same person who, goddamn, I'm going to find her name before I move on. But like, fetishes, especially foot fetishes, are like the most common fetishes in the entire world. And she, here it is. Her name is Esme Louise James. Look her up. She's fantastic. She's a PhD candidate and she does kinky history. Foot fetish is the most common in history all the time. And there are people who have tried to find biological underpinnings for it. One of them was this, I can't remember the scientist's name off the top of my head, but noticed that the somatosensory cortex here in your brain, where you can map out a homunculus of what parts of your body have experiences on different parts of your brain. Well, it just so happens that the part of your brain that feels your feet and toes is bumped right up against the part of your brain that feels your genitals. And so the idea was like, you can cross some wires here, so to speak, and both in perception and in touching. And also we can notice that during the great STI outbreaks throughout history, big gonorrhea outbreak, big syphilis outbreak, whatever, foot fetish porn goes through the fucking roof.
Sure.
And like, there's an intrinsic link there. And sometimes it was even displayed as like the safe alternative to vaginal sex that you could like, give. And so like, these are things that we can draw psychological lines to, and we can draw biological lines to, but we can't escape the reality that they're persistent and completely engross our entire society. Our entire, for lack of a better word, human history is deeply penetrated with kink and with weirdness and with sex just purely for pleasure. And we can't get away from that, and we can't pretend like there's a normal way to do things, because there just fucking isn't.
And a lot of what we've been trying to do tonight is to like run those things to ground and to try and have some explanation for it. And on a, if we step away from like the large sociological or even like anthropological lens and just look at ourselves, I think there's that same temptation to be like, well, what does my, Pornhub search history say about like my childhood experience? And you know what? There might be some value in deconstructing those things. And I do think that you can find some interesting things about yourself and maybe put together like, oh, I had this traumatic experience that now I'm trying to like gain some mastery and control over. Or, maybe when I was young, I had this erotic experience that I didn't fully understand. And now I am fascinated by it and I keep coming back to it. And those ideas, when they show up, are really interesting. And there's nothing wrong with pursuing that. But for the most part, I think that people can drive themselves crazy by trying to come up with solutions to these things. And oftentimes it's okay to just let an open question be an open question. Like, why do we have boobs? I don't know, but they're fantastic, and I'm just going to appreciate that they're here.
Right, exactly. And I think that's especially important when you're talking about, like your personal, like, why am I into this type of thing? Why do I want this type of thing? Why do I feel this type of way? I think it should be a lot more acceptable to, yeah, sure, explore the answer as much as you want to. That's fine. But don't be afraid of the answer being who cares.
Yeah, sure.
It doesn't really matter at the end of the day. Like, if you're having fun, and like, I feel like a lot of people, I think we might have touched on this last time I was here, but it's worth repeating that like most people I feel don't ever have the opportunity to really ask themselves the questions of like, am I really straight? Am I really cis? Am I really into this? Am I really not into that? They don't give themselves the opportunity to explore and to apply logic to their bizarre sexual perversions,
Right.
and also to remove logic from their bizarre sexual perversions and see what they are without it as well. And like, just kind of just bask in the warm, weird glow of their own sexuality and sexual identities. I think that if a lot more people gave themselves the opportunities to do that, we probably see a lot more people be a lot more accepting of themselves and a lot happier. And I would give as evidence of that concept is like when we poll homosexuality in the population, or any kind of what we would call deviant sexuality back in the day. There was a time when being homosexual was considered a mental disorder. And then we looked out and we found, oh, fuck, over 1,500 different animal species exhibit homosexuality. Turns out it's a thing that can just kind of happen. And like, oh, who knew? And then all of a sudden, overnight, we reprinted the DSM and everybody, like millions of people were cured of a mental disease all of a sudden. Wow, how amazing, right? And when we look at polling number, when we try to track homosexuality, sure enough, it seems to increase in the poll numbers. And we have to ask the question, are there more gay people today, or are more people comfortable saying that they're gay to a stranger in a white lab coat asking them about who they're porking? You know what I mean?
Right.
So like, that's when we take that stigma away and we allow people to express themselves.
I mean, when we let kids have left-handed desks, all of a sudden we meet all these left-handed kids. Right.
Exactly. It was of the devil. It was evil. It was sinful. It was wicked. People were beaten because they wrote with their left hands. And then we were like, hey, some people are left-handed. Guess we better just let that be a thing. And now it's cool. And it's the same thing with homosexuality. And I think, if we had a more open and inclusive society as a whole, I'm sure that if we were to repoll people in 20, 30 years, it would look like, oh my God, bisexuality is on the rise. And, no, actually, people are just kind of realizing that there's interesting stuff all over the place. And here's a fun fact. Huge percentages of straight people in straight relationships have bisexual fantasies or homosexual fantasies all the time, because there's a difference between sexual orientation and erotic orientation and
Mhm.
romantic orientation. You have your sexual orientation, what you're actually wanting to have sex with, your romantic orientation, the kind of feelings that you have, and the erotic orientation, which is just what gets you off, even if that isn't something you actually necessarily really want in your real life. And for lots of people, those three things are the same thing. And for lots of people, they aren't. And so, like, if we allow people to just be themselves and express themselves and not say, oh, I got off to this, now I'm this kind of person now, just you did, and it's cool. Have fun with it. Like, that's fine. Just be cool with yourself.
Yeah, and to that point, I guess I just really want to express that acceptance is a bird with two wings, right? There's the piece where you have to see something as it is and be able to like recognize and see something clearly rather than projecting onto it what it should be or having some heuristic on what things ought to look like. But the other piece of it is love and compassion, like a willingness to enjoy or find pleasure in whatever you find there. Back to that Carl Rogers idea of it, the curious paradox. It's not until I accept myself as I am that then I gain the ability to change or to at least work through some of these things. And so we live in a culture and in a society right now where there is violent enforcement of a lot of particularly gender norms. I would like to think that within 50 years, we will laugh about homophobia the same way we do just now on people who are left-handed. And we'll just recognize, no, that's part of our bodies. But it's also important to recognize that right now, we are violently enforcing, back to that idea earlier of your biology is everything you can be, your culture is what you are allowed to be and what you're not constricted to be. It just scares me a little bit to see, so many armed folks breaking up drag shows. And, of course, there was everything that happened at Club Q. I don't know. I don't mean to ramble overly much, and I don't mean to ask you to predict the future, but how do you feel things are sort of trending in terms of this information that you and I are discussing tonight and this idea of biology is weird, bodies are weird? Does that seem to be permeating the culture? Does it seem that 50 years from now, we'll be laughing about some of this ridiculousness?
What gives me hope and what makes me happy is that my parents and grandparents were the hippie peoples, the ones that are out there. My grandparents, I have on one side that were in the resistance fighting against Nazis in Austria, and on the other side I've got grandparents who signed up to teach the first integrated classrooms and to have integrated doctors' offices and like trying to fight against segregation there. And then my family has a long history of being on the right side of history. And what gives me hope is that the things that they talked about, the kind of message that they talked about that was so much counterculture of the time, of acceptance and love, not tolerance. I don't want to be tolerated. I want to be loved and accepted. You know what I mean? Of this integration of society with allowing people to be themselves. That same message is still being carried on today, only it's actually exponentially growing, and it's got so much wonderful traction because people like in our age group, you or mine, we are now finally at the time where we can have the clout and the leverage and the position, the authority to be able to help make these changes. And we've got Gen Z's crazy ass backing us up. You know what I mean? Like that's they're ready to fight with it. And so like I see this amazing trend of possibility, of advancement, of compassion, and I see it growing exponentially. It's not just a one issue at a time anymore. It is vast swaths of people that we're going to help now. We are now going to ameliorate society for all LGBTQIA plus. We could just use the word queer. Everybody who isn't cis and straight and all these things. And anything that goes against, and we're also going to ameliorate society for all black and brown people, and we're also going to look at all BIPOC. We're just going to bring in everybody indigenous too. We're going to just keep bringing in more and more and more, and you get confronted when you talk about armed terrorists at drag shows. You're confronted with this idea of woke, which is I've yet to find someone who can I don't know if you heard about this. I used to make fun of people and say you can't define what woke is, but somebody actually did. Ron DeSantis fired a lawyer for
I
being
caught
too
that.
woke. Yeah, and the lawyer was sued him. It was like, all right, define woke then. If you can't tell me what it is, you can't fire me for it. And they defined woke as believing that there is systemic injustice in America that needs to be addressed. So if you're a fucking election denier and a MAGA hat guy, you're woke now because you think that the election was stolen. Isn't that fun? But this is, if you can deal with reality, if you can look around us and see that, anything that goes against the cisgender, heterosexual, white, European, patriarchal hegemony is called out as being woke. If you can identify that, then, I think you're on the right side of history. And if you're willing to work for it and fix it, then yeah, I think you're doing the work that we need. And I see more and more and more and more people just very easily able to look around them and identify that things are not as black and white and cut and dry as we like to pretend that they are. And lots of people have lots of problems, and we all have a role to play in making things better. So you didn't ask me to predict the future. My future is my prediction is a good one. I think.
Hey, yeah, no, that's deeply encouraging. I'll definitely take it. But before I let you go tonight, I want to point out that all of us listening tonight kind of benefit from the fact that we live in a society of specialists, because not all of us are going to pursue all of these degrees in biology or have the opportunity to study sexuality or these different things. That said, what do you think that the average person should better understand about evolution, about biology, and how it impacts culture, and some of these things that we've been talking about tonight? I'll say I grew up in a conservative Christian environment. I did not learn any evolution theory basically at all until I was like midway through college. But what would you suggest is the place that people should maybe be putting a little bit more time and attention?
I would, if you want to know more about evolution, I think the biggest thing that people need to remember is that it's about reproduction and that it acts on phenotype. So a lot of times we talk about evolution, we talk about your genes and we talk about survival, and those are important concepts. Can't understate how important they are, but it's more about reproduction. It doesn't matter if you live for 1,000 years and never have a baby. That doesn't affect evolution then. It's not that it's all about reproduction, and also it acts on phenotype, not genotype. Your genotype makes your phenotype, but not every part of your genotype is necessarily expressed, and so you just love heterozygous advantages and blah, 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 blah. And so that's the biggest, if people want to learn about evolution, those are the things that they need to know. But as far as how it applies to culture or things like that, I would say the best thing that people can do is try to get away, at least challenge dualisms in their life. In their thinking. And what a dualism is the way that we draw hard lines between different components of biological reality. So for example, the difference between culture and nature. I live in this house, I have this computer, and I have my phone, and the way that I cook and all these are very different than living out in the wild. But they're not really. They're actually deeply connected. And you look at other cultures across the world where people are still living in these different kinds of ways, or people who are living even farther away from the wilderness, so to speak, than I would, and yet there's still this line you can draw. Find your dualism between sex and gender, and try to find a blur there where they are definitely different things, but the fact that we can't boil down gender or predict gender from sex says something. The fact that we still have performances based on sexual phenotypes is also a thing. Ask about it. Figure things out. Maybe you'll like it. Maybe you won't. Differences between men and women. Is there a difference that's notable? Is it the only difference? Differences between living and dead. That's a huge one in biology. Ask why viruses aren't considered to be alive. Just play with these dualisms and just kind of see if you can actually justify them and if you can actually draw the lines that you think you can draw. Because a lot of times it really benefits people to realize that, yes, there are boxes that we put things into, but that doesn't mean that the boxes are real.
Yeah. So the difference between mostly dead and all the way dead might be thinner than we think.
Freaking think about it. We do cancer research on people's tumor cells. People have been dead for decades, and we still have 1 million of their cells with their DNA growing in labs all over the world. If we're going to say that, cellular life is human life, and that you make it real fucking political and be like, we're going to say that a fetus, this little clump is
Right.
So does that mean that this person is still alive and weighs hundreds of pounds and lives in several different countries? Or is this a totally different thing that doesn't have a personality and an identity because it has human DNA, you know? So like there's a million things to play with there. And you realize that you already live in a world of blurry lines, even if you don't admit it. You use blurry lines all the time. You never have anything that's cut and dry. You always have exceptions. That's the coolest thing about biology, is that there's an exception to every single rule. There's not a single definition in biology that doesn't come with unless and until and except and was so long as, and like, it's just how it is. So I think if people played with that and like really kind of challenged themselves and sat down with even their most deeply held important beliefs and really questioned them and just asked, like allow themselves to feel that fuzziness and not be afraid of it, I think people would be better off.
Well said. Honestly, I'm just going to leave it there and start to take us out for the night, because pushing back on any sort of black and white thinking is just bread and butter for any good therapist. So I think you've definitely got the right of it. Look for those moments in your life where you feel like you have the answer, because that answer is squishy and should be full of caveats and exceptions and everything else.
Yep, absolutely. Only a Sith deals in absolutes.
Hey, there it is. All right. Well, with that, I want to remind folks that they can keep up with everything that's going on with the ACA on our website, atheist-community.org. You can email this show directly with sex@atheist-community.org, or the ACA itself with TV@. I want to let everybody know that we are going to be in the studio this month, even with the holidays. We are going to be on December 15th. You can catch me and Jamie Boone. The very next day, Truth Wanted will have Objectively Dan and Jason Friedman. And then on Sunday, student Dr. Ben is in town. He'll be on Talk Heathen with Dan, and then AXP with Jim Barrows. Come and join us in person. We would love to be able to answer your questions directly and to shake your hand and everything else. All of those shows that I just mentioned can be found at tiny.cc/AEN podcast in an audio-only format. That's your one-stop shop for an audio-only version of each of these shows. You can find some of the content that we've been talking about, some of the creators that we've been talking about, in the Facebook Secular Sexuality fan group. And I would encourage everybody to check out tiny.cc/FBSSG, as well as the Atheist Community of Discord, which is at tiny.cc/ACD Discord. And I want to remind people, while you still have time, that this month you can visit tiny.cc/the ACA Vault to see all of our past monthly offerings in the SecX merch store. We're going to let you save 10% off of your entire purchase by using the discount code THEVAULT and bring back past designs. When the year ends, these specials disappear as well. So make sure to come by and check out this blowout sale. And of course, I want to thank our incredible crew, those that are sick and out tonight, as well as those that helped get everything together and make us look so good. Thank you all so much for everything that you've done for us tonight. And Forrest, before I let you go, I just wanted to see if you had any kind of final thoughts or just last impressions that you want to make sure to leave with the audience tonight.
Everybody should look up lordotic reflexes, because it's a fun rabbit hole to think about. Lordosis is when you arch your back like this, and a lordotic reflex is when you arch your back and you get more into sex. And it's something we studied in rats predominantly. And so like when you stimulate the back of a female rat as if she's being mounted, she has a lordotic reflex and she arches her back to allow for penetration. And humans do it too. And it's a fun thing to think about. And it's a sciencey way to say throw it back. And that makes me very happy. And you should look it up, because there's a ton of fun, fascinating literature on that.
I just appreciate knowing that it's not just therapists that end up spending a lot of time studying and learning about rat sex, because there is just a lot of literature about rat sex.
Your psychology background and my biology background, it meets with rat sex, and it's wonderful.
So if we ever run out of things to talk about, I'll just keep.
We'll just talk about rat sex for an hour.
Rat sex, monkey dicks, whatever else. Well, I suppose with that, whether you are monogamous or non-monogamous, whatever kind of primate you are, front butts and everything else, penis bones and all of that aside, take this moment to appreciate your humanity, your opposable thumbs, your human sexuality, and give yourself a big ol' orgasm. Or better yet, give somebody else one.
Watch Talk Heathen live Sundays at 1 p.m. Central. Visit tiny.cc/YTTH and call into the show at 512-991-9242 or connect to the show online at tiny.cc/callth.